So this is quite simply fascinating. This is Konstantin Kisin, who is a secular commentator on a podcast called Trigonometry, where he interviews people from across the political and religious spectrum and ideological spectrum. And he interviews people who are super pro-Israel, people like Melanie Phillips, and also interview people who are as anti-Israel as you can possibly get, like Norman Finkelstein and who was that comedian? Bassem Youssef. Yeah, God, that guy is just delusional guy who is super anti-Israel. And he always tried to have like this balanced position and just say, I'm just listening and just asking the questions. And he says didn't actually know much about the conflict prior to October 7th. And now he produced a video which is doing the rounds online saying he has come out as being pro-Israel. His video is entitled Why I'm Off the Fence About Israel's War. And he explains why he is someone who knew very little about the conflict and is looking at the arguments in support of Israel, against Israel, and even in support of Hamas, and analysing the points one by one. And here he does a brilliant takedown. And I spoke to him and I said, can I show this to our audience and show the video? And then also there are some things that I wanted to add in as well to what he's saying, because part of his argument that you're going to see is he will try and take the arguments that the anti-Israel lot throw at Israel as being true, and then works backwards from that. But I said I'd like to add in some addition as well into this, because I also want to explain why the accusations made against Israel are often not true. So it's just important that we add those things in, I felt, for our audience who are often quite sympathetic to Israel. So let's have a watch, and I'll pause where necessary to add in some relevant additional info.
I'm off the fence about Israel's war. Here's why. Exactly a year ago, when thousands of Hamas militants crossed Israel's border to engage in an orgy of medieval violence, I knew little about Israel and had no opinion about the long-running conflict there. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Gaza. I've never been to the West Bank. It's not a conflict I studied at university or read about extensively. People on both sides who care passionately about this issue find it hard to believe, but in truth, most people are like this. That's why, for many months after the October 7th attacks, I avoided commenting on the war or even discussing it on our show. Instead, I read, watched, and listened to the endless commentary, debates, and discussions to understand what people on various sides were saying. Having gathered those perspectives, I then did my best to apply first principles thinking to the arguments I heard. Thinking from first principles means stripping whatever you're trying to analyze down to its core and working back from there. Context is extremely important to understanding. But when it comes to highly emotive situations like this one, people often flood you with emotional context which does not support the argument they're actually making. There are some obvious examples in this debate which we will address shortly. First principles thinking helps you see the structure of arguments. The logic of an argument is like the skeleton of a body. You cannot see it from the outside, but it is usually the cause of why the body moves the way that it does. Getting to the skeleton of an argument is essential to understanding it. This was my approach when we had prominent pro-Palestine guests like Bassem Youssef and Norman Finkelstein on Trigonometry, as well as pro-Israel guests like Ben Shapiro and Natasha Hausdorff. It was also my approach when I hosted a fiery debate on the subject at Dissident Dialogues, and when Safety Namus invited me to discuss this issue on his podcast. So what does first principle thinking tell us about the conflict? First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11. That isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of? Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable. However, there are some persuasive arguments from the anti-Israel camp which are aimed at contextualizing October 7th. Let's look at them. Number 1. History did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. In this conception, Israel was created because land belonging to Palestinians was taken by Western powers and given to European Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Palestinians were not consulted, did not give consent, and found themselves kicked out of their homes. Israel is a settler colonial state. 2. October 7th was a response to Israeli brutality and oppression. Those of you who watched my debate with Safety Amos will recall that he made this argument repeatedly. The people of Gaza and the West Bank are treated so badly, he argued, the response we saw on October 7th was totally understandable. An act of resistance aimed at redressing the wrongs they have suffered. 3. Israel is killing civilians. The scenes of parents pulling their children out of rubble speak for themselves. 4. Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks, which is why so many innocent people are dying. This argument aims to prove that Israel is the bad guy in this war because it is killing lots of people, either deliberately or due to a callous disregard for the lives of Palestinians. These are, to the best of my knowledge, the 4 principal arguments made by the anti-Israel side. If there are others, please let me know in the comments and I will address them in a follow-up video. Let's go through the arguments one by one, and for the sake of argument, let us accept that every point in each argument is valid and historically accurate. I know many viewers will find this objectionable, but I believe the best way to unpack this entire discussion is to take people's arguments as valid and see if they make sense. The first argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate. It feels reasonable and logical to many people to contextualize Israel's response to October 7th in this way. After all, if Israel was created through illegitimate means, it puts the discussion on an entirely different footing, doesn't it? Well, actually, no, it doesn't. Again, let's think from first principles. If we believe every pro-Palestinian claim and accept that Israel was created through the forced placement of European Jews in a foreign land by Western powers, we must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population.
Now again, I'm just going to pause just because it's important for those who want a bit more of an in-depth explanation to understand that that accusation is a lie. Okay, the Jews are not indigenous to Europe that live in Israel today. They're indigenous to that land. They all come from that land. The proof of which was also because half the Jews that returned to the land are from the Arab world in 1948. Half the Jews of Israel are Sephardi Jews, not Ashkenazi from Europe. Sephardi are from much more from or Mizrahi from the Arab world, and so it's just a lie to say that it's some kind of colonialist project. It's a decolonization project. Really important for that to bear that in mind. And the second thing to bear in mind is that displacement occurred not because Jews returned to the land and kicked everyone out. Jews returned to the land, purchased land legally, and lived alongside Arabs. And then, when the UN said, okay, we're going to decide what to do with this land, when Britain handed it over to them, the Jews said, okay, we'll accept a Jewish state and an Arab state. And the Arabs said, no, we won't accept that. The Jews had a precedent for re-establishing a Jewish state because the last sovereign state that was in that land was a Jewish one. But the Arabs had no precedent for any sovereign state in that land or distinct national identity. But nevertheless, the Jews said, fine, we'll accept splitting the land. And the Arabs said, absolutely not. And when they went to war against Israel, that's when the displacement happened. Many of them actually just displaced because the Arab army said, leave, we're going to kill the Jews, and you can come back. So now it's Israel's fault that the Arabs got displaced because they tried to kill the Jews and the Jews won.
Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest. If you go back far enough, so is almost every other country in the world. Like it or not, Israel exists. It's home to over 9 million people. The idea that they would, could, or should accept the destruction of what is now their country is absurd. The United States government would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations. Neither would any government of any country under any circumstances. Peace in the Middle East will not be achieved by attempting to undo many decades of history.
By the way, let's also be clear that when India and Pakistan were established and they had the line drawn, same year as Israel was established, there were far many more people that were made refugees, far many more killed, far many more atrocities, and no one talks about it today. No one talks about the many millions of Hindus that were displaced in that war. No one talks about the rapes that took place, the amount of people that were killed. So many more people. Yet only is when it's Israel that people seem to... I'll get these specific figures for you. 14 to 20 million people were displaced as Hindus and Sikhs moved to India and Muslims moved to Pakistan. And between hundreds of thousands to around 2 million were killed in the communal violence. That is way more. I mean, let me just search how many Arabs and Jews and Israelis have been killed in the Israeli-Arab conflict since 1948. Okay, let's see roughly the figures. It looks like it's between, on the Palestinian side, Palestinian Arabs between 50,000 to 100,000. For other Arab countries, it's 30,000 to 60,000. And for Israeli casualties, 25,000 to 30,000, although that obviously is maybe not including the what happened on October 7th, which adds another 1,200 or so. But it's ridiculous. Can you see how ridiculous this is? This ridiculous obsession with Israel, where literally far greater human rights travesties occurred, and human suffering occurs, and yet people just don't care.
The second argument centers on the idea that October 7th was a response to Israeli occupation and brutality. This, again, seems reasonable to many people. After all, what would it take for you to behave the way Hamas did on October 7th? The problem with this argument is that what happened on October 7th was not an attempt to weaken Israel militarily. It was not an attempt to break Hamas militants out of Israeli jails. It was not an attack on the Israeli Defense Force. It was not a prison breakout, as some people like to describe it, because when people break out of a prison, they don't normally head to the nearest town and start massacring women and children. October 7th was, by design and implementation, a terrorist attack whose purpose was to slaughter civilians, terrify Israeli society, and nothing else. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terror. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terrorism, which is why Israel had to react to it in the manner that it has, and why any other country would have done the same. The third argument is that Israel is killing...
I would also like to point out as well, a really important point to make, that if my grandparents' generation after World War II left the death camps of the Nazis and they went and started butchering German children and babies and raping random German women, no one would see that as legitimate. I have no doubt in my mind that the social justice warriors would not have any time for those that would support that kind of action. So it's just such nonsense that people try and justify this as resistance. And what they sometimes try to do is they try to deny what Hamas did. They try to deny the rapes, the murdering of children and babies and innocents and dogs and all the rest of it. Of course they have to deny it, because otherwise they're forced to confront the evil of the ideology at the heart of Palestinianism.
Civilians. This is the one claim made by the anti-Israel side that is undeniably true. However, this is an example of the emotive but irrelevant context I mentioned earlier. Civilians are always killed in war. The question is not whether they're being killed, but who bears responsibility for their deaths and who can stop the killing. Again, applying first principles thinking, we must reach for a comparable example. There is no exact equivalent that comes to mind, but there is some useful context we can consider. Hamas has repeatedly stated that given the opportunity, they will repeat the October 7th attacks again and again and again. While this may seem shocking to us in the West, it makes perfect sense given that Hamas believes Israel is illegitimate and would like to see it gone. This means that unless Israel destroys or degrades their ability to carry out their threats, it is likely to experience more terrorist attacks again and again. Does anyone seriously believe that any government of any country anywhere in the world would or could react to something like 12 9/11s in one day and the threat of more to follow as many times as possible with anything other than all-out war? And who can end the killing? Well, theoretically Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. That leaves Hamas, who could have returned the hostages and surrendered the people who took them. What is more, they could hide their civilians in the vast network of tunnels they've built to reduce casualties. Instead, they refuse to build bomb shelters and do everything they can to maximize civilian casualties. That's not my opinion, it's something Hamas are themselves proud of. A senior spokesman for the group, Sami Abu Zuhri, gave an interview on Palestinian station Al-Aqsa TV the last time this conflict flared up. The policy of people confronting Israeli warplanes with their bare chests in order to protect their homes has proven effective against the occupation, he said. We in Hamas call upon our people to adopt this policy in order to protect Palestinian homes. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic, and in a modern world where you can fill your social media feed with gruesome footage, that tragedy can be broadcast straight into your home 24/7. But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone. Which brings us to the final argument. Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. This is actually the simplest argument of the four to address because it is an empirical matter. The war in Gaza is not the first conflict in human history. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. What happens when we do? Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. This doesn't mean that there won't be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie. If you need further evidence that claims of Israel's indiscriminate attacks are nonsense, just look at the way various commentators reacted to what has been dubbed Operation Grim Reaper. Thousands of Hezbollah pages were rigged with explosives and then detonated simultaneously, killing and injuring thousands of terrorists and a small number of bystanders. The pages in question were not picked at random. Israel specifically selected a batch of senior Hezbollah operatives. And still, people like Hamza Yusuf, Scotland's former First Minister, complain about Israel's indiscriminate attacks. This was definitionally the most precise, targeted and surgical large-scale anti-terrorist operation in human history. In summary, I've engaged with an open mind and in good faith with all the anti-Israel arguments.
Just want to add as well that the other point to make is that ultimately all the suffering and the deaths in a conflict that suffered by innocent bystanders lie on the side of the aggressor. The onus lies on the side of the aggressor, the one that's provoking this conflict, provoking the war. So the responsibility for deaths on the Arab side is Hamas's entirely. Number one, for being the aggressor and forcing Israel to have to fight them, and number two, also because they're trying to maximize, their strategy is to maximize the suffering of their own people.
As presented to me over the last year. On balance, I regard them as disingenuous, irrelevant, and designed to pull at my heartstrings in order to obscure the harsh reality of this conflict. We would respond exactly the way that Israel has. The only difference is we would do so with the support of every member of the international community.
And they actually probably go further than what Israel's doing, quite frankly.
While Israel has to fight not only the terrorists who want to wipe them off the map, but Western apologists for those terrorists as well. If you enjoy these videos, you should...
So I have to say that I think it's a great video because it's taking the arguments of the anti-Israel side as valid and then working that way. But I do think it's so important to say that while we often say, look, all countries may have win wars and that's how they get founded, and so why are you playing this game with regard to Israel and focusing on her original sin? I do have to say though, the other thing that's worth noting is that actually, if we wanted to think critically about how countries were formed, the country that I think would have the most morally clear record of them all would actually be the State of Israel. At least in the top tier. Because Israel is the historic ancient homeland of the Jews. And what happened with its re-establishment in 1948 was a process of decolonization. It had been colonized by so many other colonial powers for 2,000 years. And when it was returned to the Jews, the indigenous people of the land, this was an epic moment of decolonization. The term Palestine is a colonialist term, a European colonialist term. How's that? Imagine saying that to some of the anti-colonialist, pro-Palestine protesters. They're supporting colonialism. The Arabs are not indigenous to the land, and the Jewish state has always been happy to have Arabs live in the land, but with just one little condition, that they not try to kill us. But I think it's a great video from Konstantin Kisin, and it's worth promoting and sharing. Share it with people, because sometimes it's good to just say, okay, let's just work through your arguments and not try and rebut them, but just think, if that's true, then is what you're saying still morally acceptable? Because it turns out it's not. It's full of lies, immorality, nonsense claims. And it's great to see people coming off the fence, like Konstantin is, and standing up for what is so clearly true. And just as in the story of The Emperor's Got No Clothes, it takes people to say what everyone's thinking, but is scared to say, all of us need to have that confidence to say what is so obvious to us that people are afraid to say. Because the more of us that do it, the more we'll reach a critical mass when actually the tide of opinion will really turn. If you've made it so far in this video, I have a request for you. JTV has been having a really big impact in spreading the truth about Israel and creating positive associations with the Jewish people, Judaism, and Israel. We've really grown a lot, particularly in the last year, and we're having a really significant impact, both for Jews and non-Jews. But I really want to take JTV to the next level so we can start to compete with the other big online media beasts that are often peddling anti-Israel content. And the way we're going to do that is to scale even faster. So I'd love to build a team where we have other presenters doing shows like me. Let's start doing documentaries, supplementary content, animated content, etc., etc. And to do that, I'd like to build a bit of a team. So what we're going to do is we're going to do one fundraising day, just one, where we try and build up some funding in order to fund such a team. Now, to do that, it's going to obviously require people to get involved. And I'm wondering if you would consider, if you're watching JTV content and appreciate what we do and want to help partner with us in taking this to the next level and spreading the truth farther and wider than ever before, I wonder if you'd consider partnering with us simply by running a page, a mini page on the fundraiser that we do, where you just reach out to your contacts on that day that we choose to fundraise and see if they'll all chip in. If you'd be up for doing that, of which I would be so grateful, then please click on the Google form link in the video description of this video, where you can simply just put in a few contact details. It'll be a very small commitment, as I say, literally just one day that we'll all agree upon as a collective community. But the impact is going to be so big. There's such strength in numbers. If we all pull together and do this, we can take this to the next level. And as I say, all of us can partner together in bringing and spreading the truth to the whole world. So please do consider clicking on that link, filling in the form, and I'll be in touch very soon to talk about the next steps. Small commitment, but a big impact. Hi, thank you so much for watching. To watch another one, click here. To stay up to date with all our content, click here to subscribe. And if you're able to, you can help support JTV to grow and grow by clicking join below this video, where you can become a member and get perks including early access to videos and private live discussions with me. But most of all, you'll be partnering with us on our mission to change the world.